Hi there, I'm Ollie Dugmore, the Head of News and Politics at PoliticsJOE, and I'm joined by Symon Hill, who has made the headlines somewhat this week. Symon, it might be best if you explain what's happened to you and what you've been up to in your own words.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for talking to me. I had an unexpected couple of days. On Sunday, I went to church as normal in Oxford, where I live. I was walking home from church and was caught up in the crowds caused by the roads being shut off for the official proclamation of Charles as a new king. It was very difficult with the police closing roads and so on, moving around. When the proclamation started, the first part was about grief for Elizabeth, for the previous monarch, and of course I understand people are grieving. I wouldn't want to interrupt anybody's mourning. But then when it came to proclaiming Charles, we had this very sort of medieval declaration telling us we will now accept Charles as our only rightful Lord and King. And I found that pretty hard to stomach in a 21st century democracy. And I found that pretty hard to stomach in a 21st century democracy. Also, as a Christian, I call Jesus my Lord and King. Not everyone does, I respect that. But I think we all have a right to have a say in who our head of state is. So when this medieval instruction was read out, I called out who elected him. I was at the back of the crowd. Very few people could hear me, I think. But a couple of people turned around and told me to shut up, as they, can't do that. That's their freedom of speech. I said a head of state's being imposed without our consent. Before I knew it, there were security guards pushing me backwards, and then the police had grabbed me, led me off, handcuffed me, put me in the back of a police van, and told me I was under arrest. And I was gobsmacked. I don't think I'm naive about the police misuse of powers, but actually, I literally said a couple of sentences in a public street.
So your one instance, we've seen this happen a couple of times now, right? It's happened multiple times in Scotland as well. And I know the legal systems and the justice systems, they are different and they are separate to each other. So there is a slight difference there. I think what's happened in Scotland is people have been arrested and in actually some cases charged, which is extraordinary.
At least two of them have been charged. Yeah.
I
mean, one of them was a woman who just held up a placard saying abolish the monarchy, and just being charged with the breach of the peace, which I find really worrying.
It's an instance. Well, okay. Well, what do you think? Do you think this represents overreach by the police? Do you think? Yeah. Okay. Go on.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm aware that the police misuse of powers is not a new thing. I think many people are subject to unfair treatment by the police, and many of them, we know all the evidence around that and about racism from the police and so on. I think what we're seeing in the last few days is a real misuse of the situation following the sad death of Elizabeth Windsor last week, whereby people feel grief, they're mourning, and this is being conflated. The grief, which of course I respect, is being conflated with an automatic assumption that we must accept Charles Windsor as the new head of state without discussing it. And we've seen appalling situations of the police arresting and, as you say in Scotland, charging people for very, very minor things. If you can't hold up a placard criticising the head of state, that is very dangerous for what it says about democracy and free speech in Britain. If we heard of that happening elsewhere in the world, I think we'd make a judgment about what sort of country that was. And I think in Britain there's a strong tradition. Our ancestors campaigned for free speech. Our ancestors campaigned for democracy. The rights we have weren't just handed down to us by the rich and powerful. People campaigned for them, and now again we see monarchy being used as as an excuse to suppress them, and for the police to misuse their power.
Yeah, I'll be honest. The first thing I thought of when I saw these reports about the woman with the placard being charged, it reminded me of the scenes we saw in Russia in February. You know, the people that were out protesting against the illegal invasion of Ukraine, and you know, the police dragging people down the street, throwing them in the back of vans, or even in some instances, you know, targeting activists before they even left their homes and just arresting them.
Absolutely.
And that's an authoritarian dictatorship.
Indeed, I mean, Putin's Russia. Over 15,000 Russians have very bravely been arrested for protesting against the appalling invasion of Ukraine, and you know, in Russia it became a practice for people to protest by holding up a blank piece of paper, because then they couldn't be accused of an anti-war slogan, and then people were arrested for holding the blank piece of paper. What we've seen now is that somebody opposed to the monarchy has gone and tried to do that in London, and been told that if he wrote "Not My King" on the piece of paper, he would be arrested, told that by a police officer he recorded it. And I think, I'm not suggesting that Britain is as authoritarian as Putin's Russia, but I fear that's the direction we're heading if we don't, you know, if we accept what's being done in the name of monarchy, and you know, the whole misuse of the grief that people naturally feel at somebody's death, to say not only must we accept a new head of state, but we can't even discuss it, and those who question it will be arrested. This is not the democracy that I think most of us thought we were living in.
Do you think someone could come back to you and say, you know, look, we elected a Conservative Party, big old majority, and part of their platform as a democratic elected party is to introduce the police, crime courts and sentencing bill, which has cracked down on, you know, people were talking about it, disruptive or annoying protests as a legitimate reason for dispersing people. People say, you know what, we voted for this, it's been enacted, what can you complain about?
Well, I mean, one aspect is the issues of the electoral system. Of course, the Conservative Party didn't get more than half the votes. Liz Truss wasn't elected as Prime Minister by anyone other than a handful of Conservative Party members. But even leaving that aside, their own manifesto didn't promise anything as draconian as that bill in terms of civil liberties. And also, civil liberties don't depend on majority approval. Like, somebody has a right to express a view that the majority disagree with. That even if the majority vote for something, that if 51% of people support something, that doesn't mean 49% of people can't also express their opinions, even if they may not be able to get their policy adopted. And what's significant, I think, about that bill, the Police Crime Sentencing Courts Bill, is I was told by the police that that's the law I'd been arrested under. It took them ages to come to that conclusion. I kept asking them, and they eventually told me. And then the police have now been telling journalists who asked for a comment from the police that I was arrested under the Public Order Act 1986, which is a completely different law. So, you know, whatever view you take of the monarchy or the police or anybody, surely in a civilized country, in a place where rights are respected and the police are accountable, when somebody is arrested, there should be reasonable grounds for the arrest, and they should be told why they've been arrested, and it should be clear. If the police are arresting people arbitrarily to the point where they don't even know what law they're arresting them under, then, you know, I mean, it's funny on one level, but it's also very frightening.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I think we can have this conversation about, you know, there's that young guy in Scotland who was sort of shouting at Andrew as the funeral procession was walking down the road. And to your point earlier about whether or not you would protest when people were mourning or grieving, and obviously he's chosen to do that there and then. And you can have an argument about whether you think that's distasteful or whether you think that's an appropriate time to protest. But the fundamental point is the consequences of arrest as a result of that. We can't be arresting people because we find things distasteful or we disagree with the political positions that they're arguing. Or in his case, you know, it wasn't even a political position. It was you know, a broader point about Prince Andrew's legal history.
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, speaking personally, I wouldn't protest at a funeral procession when there are people grieving. That's my position. But in terms of that man in Edinburgh, he was not only arrested but charged with breach of the peace, which seems well, I can't help contrasting the police's failure to investigate or charge Andrew Windsor with anything with the speed with which they have charged a lone person who shouted out at him. And I think, you know, we see very clearly the effect of social status on the police's behaviour in that situation.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It speaks so directly and clearly about whose interests the police serve and who they're there to protect, I think. We've spoken a lot about other cases, people who've been charged, arrested, and charged. You brought us up to the point where you were charged. Sorry, beg your pardon. Where you were arrested in Oxford. What happened afterwards? Are you facing criminal charges as well, Simon?
Not as far as I know yet, but it's not certain. So after putting me in the van, they drove me to the police station, which is literally a few yards away. Any of your viewers who know Oxford will know it's in St Aldate's, which is literally the same road I've been arrested in. But they didn't take me in. They kept me in the van outside. There was a lot of police talking to each other, talking on their radios, trying to work out what they were doing with me. I was asked if I'd be interviewed. They asked to interview me. I said I'd be interviewed with a lawyer present. They seemed to decide that was too much of a faff then, because they de-arrested me and said I'd be, or I might be, contacted and asked to give an interview at a later date where I could bring a lawyer, and that it was possible I could still be charged. They then drove me home in the police van. I still hadn't been given a clear answer as to which law I'd been charged under. Only at the last minute did the policeman who was with me tell me it was definitely the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act. And as I say, that was then contradicted by the police speaking to the media later. So I find it very worrying. Even the police don't know what grounds they've got for arresting you. You know, if anyone hearing about this thinks, well, that'll be used against some, you know, a few people with some minority views, that'll be used against anti-monarchists, that'll be used against left-wingers. A law or a culture or a practice that enables the police to arrest people for expressing one view can also be used to arrest them for expressing another view. If the police can ignore the law when arresting me, they can ignore the law when arresting somebody very different to me. So this is, I think this isn't about me, it's about all of us and the rights we have. Obviously, there are limits on free speech. I don't defend anyone's right to incite violence or to stir up hatred against a particular group. And as I say, personally, I wouldn't disrupt an act of mourning. But very much we need to err on the side of recognising free speech. If we can't cope with listening to views that we disagree with, then that doesn't bode well for a healthy, functioning modern democracy.
Yeah, very worrying consequences for freedom of speech, for sure. Here, final question for you, Simon: has this put you off protest or other acts of civil disobedience, or likewise in the future? Has it deterred you from you accessing your right to free speech?
Not as such, no. It hasn't. In fact, in some ways, it's made me more determined to exercise that right. I mean, I would point out I wasn't engaging in civil disobedience. Yeah. I was expressing a view in this. I have engaged in civil disobedience before, and I think there's a place for non-violent civil disobedience when it's thought through and considered, and not just as a habit. But this time, I wasn't even doing that. I was just expressing a view in the street. It's made me more nervous of it. It's made me more cautious about the responses. But I don't want to be intimidated by this. There's some people who will be frightened of being arrested after hearing this news. Some people for whom being arrested will have worse consequences than it will for me, for example. I'm not going to be sacked from my job for being arrested. I'm not going to suffer some other consequences some people might. So if anyone is deterred from speaking out for fear of being arrested, I can understand why they would choose not to speak out. But it really, really worries me that could happen, and that's why that free speech could be suppressed by fear of being arrested, whether or not people are. So I'm more determined to speak out. And when it comes to Charles Windsor's coronation, I would, I think it's important that those of us who disagree with that have the freedom to peacefully go along, hold placards outside, whatever it may be. I won't be aggressive, I won't be violent, I won't be swearing. But if we don't have the freedom to protest outside the coronation, then I think that says something really, really worrying about the state of democracy. If, for example, the police were to arrest known anti-monarchists just before the coronation, which I'm slightly fearful of, then that would say something pretty similar. So on the one hand, it's made me more nervous, but it's also made me more determined.
Symon, thanks very much for taking the time to speak
to
us. I really appreciate it, and I hope you get some of the rest you were talking about before we started recording.
Thank you very much.